Право не крути! Скорость добавил. О! Вот сейчас вы. Все нормально. Потихоньку на тебя, потихоньку.
It's March in 1994 in Moscow. Russia's national airline Aeroflot is scheduled to fly from Moscow to Hong Kong as flight AFL 593. The crew today has 3 pilots instead of the usual 2, due to the long duration of the journey. Pilot in command, Captain Danilov, with more than 9,000 flying hours. His backup pilot, Captain Kudrinsky, and co-pilot Piskarev. All 3 pilots are type-rated on the Airbus A310 aircraft, which is in use today, and have had training provided just a few months prior on the Moscow-Hong Kong route. It's also worth noting that neither of the pilots have had any prior safety-related incidents. Also on board the flight are 63 passengers and 9 cabin crew members. Amongst those passengers are Captain Kudrinsky's children, his daughter Yana and his older son Eldar. There is also another pilot, Maskarev, who is flying as a passenger on this flight. At 4:39 p.m., the aircraft departs Moscow. It has a regular pushback, engine start, then taxis to the runway and takes off. About 12 minutes later, it reaches its initial cruise altitude of 30,000 feet. It stays at that altitude for around half an hour, and once it's a bit lighter after burning some fuel, it climbs further up to 33,000 feet. The aircraft then maintains that altitude for the next 3.5 hours. At this point in the flight, the pilot in command, Captain Danilov, decides to head to the crew rest area for a couple of hours to take some rest. And his backup pilot, Captain Kudrinsky, comes in and takes up the left seat in the cockpit. Co-pilot Piskarev is sat on the right-hand seat as per usual. Then, at 40 minutes past 5 p.m., 3 other people who are flying as passengers enter the cockpit. These are Captain Kudrinsky's 2 children, his 15-year-old son Eldar and 13-year-old daughter Yana, and Maskarev, who is a pilot but flying as a passenger on this flight. The 3 of them are simply stood in the cockpit for the first few minutes, observing the cockpit and likely engaging in conversation with Captain Kudrinsky and co-pilot Piskarev, both of who are sat on their seats. Then, a few minutes later, Captain Kudrinsky invites his daughter to sit in the left seat where he is currently sat at. He leaves his seat without formally transferring the controls of the aircraft to the co-pilot sat next to him. Then, Yana sits down on the left seat and asks for the seat to be raised. And then for the next 4 minutes or so, she sits and calmly observes the cockpit without touching any instruments or controls. After that, Captain Kudrinsky invites her to fly the aircraft a little bit, and he says, "Go ahead and take the controls." Following this exchange, for the next 3 minutes, Captain Kudrinsky shows Yana how the aircraft is flown, and he performs the following maneuver. First, he engages the heading select sub-mode, and then he turns the heading select knob to the left. This makes the aircraft turn towards the left. Then he turns this heading knob back to the right to return back to the planned flight route, and then engages the navigation sub-mode so that the aircraft can return to its initial planned route. Once this is done, Yana gets up and leaves the captain's seat. Captain Kudrinsky has performed this demonstration whilst he was not sat at his seat. This would have also been distracting for the rest of the crew. Overall, Yana was sat occupying the captain's seat for 7.5 minutes. Then, 15 minutes later, co-pilot Piskarev spoke on the radio with the Novosibirsk control tower, and he reported passing overhead and gave them the estimated arrival at the next waypoint. Just around this time, Captain Kudrinsky's son Eldar then asks for permission to sit on the captain's seat where his sister Yana had sat earlier. Once Eldar has sat and adjusted himself onto the seat, Captain Kudrinsky decides to show him how to fly the aircraft, and performs a similar demo as he had done before when he showed Yana. After the demo has been done, Eldar's curiosity takes over and he asks his dad if he can turn the control wheel. And to this request, his father, Captain Kudrinsky, agrees and gives him permission. Eldar first applies a force to the control wheel to turn the aircraft to the left, but the autopilot being on and functioning normally resists this interference by deflecting the right aileron to try and bring the aircraft back to the right. Captain Kudrinsky then engages the heading select sub-mode on the autopilot and turns the heading select knob to the left by a value more than 15 degrees of the initial heading that they were flying at. The autopilot then takes over, deflects the left ailerons, and turns the aircraft to the left. When the bank angle is around 20 degrees, Captain Kudrinsky turns the heading select knob back to the right to return the aircraft to its planned heading. The autopilot once again responds to this by moving the right aileron and inducing a right turn. Then, he engages the navigation submode on the autopilot and expects the aircraft to return to its original planned route. However, this time, the aircraft does not return back to its original planned route. At this time, two other things are happening in the background. Firstly, Yana is speaking to her dad, Captain Kudrinsky, and as a result, he is distracted and not monitoring his son's actions. Secondly, as the aircraft is turning right using the autopilot, the control wheel is still being held by about 3 degrees to the right by Eldar. And as the autopilot tries to reduce this right turn to level off and come out on the correct heading, the control wheel being held prevents this from happening. And at this stage, the autopilot keeps trying harder each second to stop this right turn. On the Airbus A310, when the autopilot is engaged, the aileron on either side of the aircraft's wing can react to keep the roll rate in control. The control column in the cockpit can also be used even though the autopilot is engaged, and it can also apply a force on the ailerons as well. And when the combined forces on the control wheels exceeds 11 kilograms, it declutches the aileron actuator. This shifts the aircraft's lateral control, which is the turn, from an autopilot mode to a manual mode, whilst keeping the aircraft's longitudinal control, which is its height control, in the autopilot mode. Usually, this disengagement of the autopilot can be felt when the force on the control wheel drops. However, there are no alarms or warning indicators to inform the pilots that this disengagement has happened, as the forces experienced on the control wheel keeps increasing. As Eldar has held the control wheel to the right, the autopilot tries harder to fight this. This causes the force on the control wheel to increase above 11 kilograms. And as shown earlier, this disconnects it from the lateral control system, and the aircraft is now in a manual control mode for the turn. Neither of the pilots are actually trained to understand how this mechanism works and what to do in such a case. Eldar, being just 15 years old and not having any flying experience, would not have been able to determine that the autopilot had disconnected itself from the lateral control mode. Now, despite the autopilot being disengaged, the control wheel is still being held slightly to the right, and this causes the right bank angle of the aircraft to start increasing gradually. However, initially, this goes unnoticed by Captain Kudrinsky and his co-pilot Piskarev. And then, a short while later, this bank angle increases to 20 degrees and keeps rolling to the right at about 1 degree per second. Because of the slow increase in this bank angle, it goes unnoticed in the cockpit, and the pilots are unaware that the aircraft is in a turn. Captain Kudrinsky at this point is thinking that the aircraft is back on its initial heading and flying straight. The control wheel keeps being held by Eldar with increasing force than before, and this is causing the right turn to increase more rapidly. Beyond 20 degrees of bank angle, the rate at which the aircraft keeps turning has risen from 1 degree per second, and shortly, the aircraft's bank angle exceeds 30 degrees. This excessive bank angle is first noticed by Eldar himself, and he draws attention to his father and says, "Why is it turning?" To which Captain Kudrinsky replies, asking, "Is it turning by itself?" At this stage, the pilots are now aware of this turn, not realizing that the control wheel is still being held to the right by Eldar. Makarov, a passenger on this flight who is also in the cockpit and also a commercial pilot, makes an incorrect suggestion that the aircraft has entered a holding pattern. A holding pattern is a set course that the aircraft follows when it's awaiting further clearance to either proceed ahead or land. This misinterpretation of the holding pattern by Makarov is likely due to the aircraft's bank angle, which he misinterprets as the aircraft trying to follow a course. As the bank angle keeps further increasing and reaches 50 degrees, surprisingly, neither of them react to this extreme bank angle. Due to the sharp turn exceeding 50 degrees, the aircraft can no longer maintain its altitude, and as a result, the aircraft now begins to descend. As the speed of the aircraft begins to increase in a descent, the aircraft begins to undergo buffeting, essentially a form of vibration and oscillation that can happen when the airflow over the wing keeps detaching. This causes the nose of the aircraft to pitch up sharply from 5 degrees to 10 degrees in a matter of seconds. This is when the seriousness of the situation kicks in. Captain Kudrinsky is heard shouting to Eldar, telling him to hold the control column tight. As the pilots were busy in conversing, they had all lost situational awareness before this moment. Then, only a few seconds later, the bank angle is now at 63 degrees. At this point, co-pilot Piskarev turns the wheel sharply to the left to counter this right turn. However, Eldar, who is still sat in the left side seat, has held the control wheel to the right as before. Note that at this stage, due to the rapid rate at which the aircraft is turning and the forces experienced inside, it is not easy anymore for Eldar to get out and hand over the controls to his father, and the bank angle keeps further increasing to the right. Within seconds, they have reached a bank angle of 90 degrees, and it's become almost impossible to recover from this situation. The action to counteract the right turn by the co-pilot was taken too late, as had he done this when the aircraft's bank angle was below 40 degrees, there would have been enough time and aileron effectiveness to get the aircraft leveled out. During this time, both the captain and co-pilot can be heard saying, "The other way, turn left, left," implying to Eldar to turn the control wheel to the left and not to the right as he's doing so. Then, the warning alarms in the cockpit all start to go off. Altitude discrepancies, stall, and the autopilot off. The nose of the aircraft begins to drop sharply, and within 10 seconds, the nose has pitched down to almost 50 degrees. The speed is also rapidly increasing as the aircraft falls towards the ground. Then, the speed exceeds the maximum allowable limits. In response to this overspeed, co-pilot Piskarev shouts, "Throttle to idle," and then puts the engine thrust to idle and proceeds to pull the control column all the way to the back. This puts the nose up sharply. By pitching the nose up and reducing the engine power at once, there is a rapid drop in the airspeed, and this time, the airspeed drops below the critical level. This leads to another problem. Due to the very low airspeed, the aircraft enters into a spin whilst falling towards the ground. This is almost uncontrollable, as there is not enough airspeed to use the ailerons to stop the spin. Also, as the aircraft is now vertically dropping towards the ground, this induces a sense of weightlessness. Seeing the airspeed being so low, the co-pilot then shouts, "Full power," and then puts the throttles ahead to try and get the airspeed to increase. At the same time, Captain Kudrinsky also manages to regain his seat, finally. This time though, there is only a couple thousand feet of altitude remaining. Sadly, not much can be done to recover this aircraft. A few seconds later, with all attempts having failed, Flight 593 crashes into the ground near the area of a town known as Mesas. The air traffic control in the region calls the aircraft repeatedly, but as expected, receives no response back. About an hour and a half later, the air traffic control is informed that an aircraft has crashed and flames that can be seen coming from the crash site. A rescue operation is launched using a search helicopter, but it's impossible to land at this crash site as it's night and the area is wooded and mountainous. Then, on the 22nd of March, the next day, a team of 238 people is formed to conduct a search and rescue operation. Unfortunately, this soon turns into a recovery operation as there are no survivors to this crash due to the high-speed impact.